the development of social cognition and executive function during adolescence, and as part of the Center for Educational Neuroscience, how some of this research might have implication for educational practice. So a bit like the symposium and the seminar in a couple of weeks, we're interested in cognitive control, which is the ability to flexibly adapt one's behavior in the pursuit of an internal goal by the coordination of cognitive processes. And we use the term interchangeably with executive functions. And cognitive control and executive functions continue to mature during adolescence. And there is still, the evidence is still not super convincing, but possibly there is some increasing dissociation between different executive functions. So the structure of how these different aspects of cognitive control relate to each other might be different at different ages. And so this is relevant for today's talk because we will be looking at different age groups. So cognitive control broadly has been implicated with education in lots of different ways. Cognitive control is crucial in most classroom settings, whether it's to try for children to keep the attention on the task, where they're attending to the teacher or at home to their homework. It's also involved in monitoring their performance. So for example, monitoring the errors, and they've done some work with this with Suzanne Dumontheil. And also there are more specific association, for example, between working memory and mathematics that have been demonstrated. And so there's a lot of interest in this field, partly to just better understand individual differences, to understand potential difficulties in education that might be related to cognitive control differences. But also, and this is what we'll talk about at the end, in terms of what interventions could be designed based on this research to maybe help academic outcome. So today the focus is on counterintuitive science and maths reasoning. So there are a lot of topics in science and maths that are counterintuitive. So by this we mean things that where the concept that you might learn at school or from your parents is different from what you might feel is the reality or the right relationship. So the easiest one to think about is the fact that it looks like the sun is moving around the earth. We talk about the sun rising and the sun setting as if it's the sun that is moving. And then children then learn that actually it's the earth that is rotating around itself. And that's why we get the impression that the sun is moving in the sky. And there are others, for example, in terms of animal and classification of animals, there are some animals like dolphins that live in the water, they have fins, but they're not fish. And that's kind of counterintuitive because if you just think about their world and their anatomical properties, you might think that they're fish. So before starting schools, there are these concepts in gravity, related to inertia, balance. During the school years, the discussion, they're related to concepts about life and death, temperatures and states of matter. And in adults, we continue to have some of these misconceptions, for example, related to gravity or electricity. And we actually had a seminar a very long number of years ago where we were arguing about the fact that if you have two water bottle exactly the same and one filled with one water and the other one not, they should land at the same time, and people in the audience would just not believe it. Thinking that even in adulthood misconceptions can remain. So these are for science. In maths there are also a whole range of them. As a couple of examples, this one is about angles. And so driven by the fact that the lines are larger and it gives the impression that the angle is larger. Or here's a relationship between surface area and perimeter, where you feel like a larger surface would be associated with a larger perimeter when it's not actually necessary. There are also example or cases where prior learning might lead to some new concepts being counterintuitive. So for example, children learn that larger integers associated with like bigger values, but when they move to fractions, actually 2/3 has kind of smaller number, but is a bigger fraction than 5/9. And when they look at decimals, the children know that 40 is bigger than 1, and so they might think that 2.4 is actually bigger than 2.1 when I actually got the example wrong here. So this is where counterintuitive. So this would be 2. For example, if we had 2.15 and 2.2, they would think that 2.15 is bigger than 2.2 on its own. So there's a whole range of these, and the people have been trying to understand what cognitive processes might be involved in reasoning about counterintuitive concepts. And inhibitory control has been thought to be particularly important. So there's this idea that the intuitive reasoning is kind of a faster response. And when we have to favor instead the correct concept, we have to inhibit this faster intuitive response in favor of a slower, more reasoned, correct concept. And so that, which means in terms of a schematic proposed by Denis Maréchal, who has been a collaborator on this research here in the CM, is this idea that evidence-based instructions might kind of interact with prior beliefs or experience or direct perception, and to kind of reach a correct answer, these prior belief, experience, and direct perception might need to be inhibited. So you can actually favor what you've learned in terms of the correct concept. And so this favoring of the evidence-based instruction is kind of school-based, really, or from your parents or from your reading, is the kind of the favoring of this is thought to be enabled by inhibition of the prior belief, experience, and direct perception. So inhibition is actually a very broad concept, which is thought to kind of relate to inhibiting distracting information or irrelevant information or dominant information that doesn't fit with your current goal. That can also be related to inhibiting a dominant response. And so there's actually a whole range of aspects of inhibition, and there's debate about whether inhibition is a unitary concept or whether the different components are actually quite distinct. And there's kind of a lot of research on this. But in our research, we try to use different measures of inhibition to try and help with this. So this is the model. Is there any evidence that inhibitory control is actually involved in counterintuitive reasoning? There is some behavioral evidence. For example, undergraduate students and adolescents have longer reaction times when they're reasoning about counterintuitive problems versus non-counterintuitive concepts. And this kind of slower response has been interpreted as evidence of involvement of complex cognitive processing, such as potentially inhibitory control. There's also some evidence that primary school children who are slower on a Stroop task are also slower on a counterintuitive reasoning task. So there's a correlation between performance on these two different types of tasks. In the study, the year groups were not considered separately, and we know that over the course of development, reaction times get faster. So it's unclear how much of this might be driven by general changes in reaction time. In young adults, another study also found that there are individual differences in inhibitory control predicted maths counterintuitive reasoning in a decimal comparison task. So it's kind of further kind of evidence of potential association. So you can see, if you're interested in this, there's a recent review by Steve Mason and Zaccoletti on this, which summarize the research very well. But overall, there are some associations that have been observed and some studies relying on other methods like priming, but it tends to be that the associations are not very big with behavioral association. And we've tried to look into this ourselves in adolescents, and this was research carried out by my former PhD student, Annie Berkman-Byrne. And we were interested, and this was work done with Denis Maréchal and Andrew Tormey. And we were interested in looking at both science and maths and going beyond what a lot of research had done before, where they were focusing on very specific concepts, so for example, gravity or electricity or perimeter to surface area relationships, and instead cover a whole range of problems in science and maths that are related to the curriculum. And so this was related to the key stage, wrong key stage 3 curriculums during like age 11 to 15. So just to give an example of the electrical circuit one of a science problem, this would be an example where they would sometimes pictures, text, different combination, mainly to make it engaging to the pupils, and also make it kind of maybe a bit more similar to what they would be facing in class. And so that there's a statement like the circuit would light both bulbs, and participants have to say whether this is true or false. And this relates to misconception, and the statement is incorrect, because in fact you need 2 wires to an electrical circuit for a light to light up. So the correct statement is actually that the circuit would light just 1 bulb. And we also had control trials. For example, here, this circuit will light both bulbs, or this circuit will light just 1 bulb, where the answer is not counterintuitive. The concept is not counterintuitive. So most people know that if you don't have any wire going to a lamp, then they're not going to be, it's not going to light up. So each of these problems was presented to the participants, the adolescents, either as an incorrect or as a correct statement. And they were all presented with both the misconception and the control trial for a particular topic. And of course, we tried to match the control problems as much as we could with the misconception problems. So you can see here the sentence length and the stimuli, like the picture, are very similar. But the control, by definition, the control trials are easier because they're less, they're not counterintuitive. So the answer, the first answer that comes to mind would be more correct. So accuracy tends to be higher. An example of maths is related to the perimeter task. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but basically we had, I'm trying to remember now, but something like 40 different concepts that were covered in maths and science. So the participants were 90 adolescents, age 11 to 15, and the topics included in the problem were quite varied. So for science, we had biology, chemistry, and physics, covering things from cell inheritance to heating, gravity, temperature. And in maths, also had a range of domains: algebra, shapes, statistics, probability graphs. So it feels like maybe we're combining more different domains in science than maths, but actually also in maths, graphs, statistics, and arithmetics are very different topics. And the results showed that we were looking at individual differences, running kind of random multiple regressions, analysis, that better semantic inhibition. So I forgot to say that we had 2 tasks. One was a strip reaction time, a strip task, which was a numerical strip. So this is where you see numbers and you have to say how many numbers on the screen, and you might have 3 threes. So this is a concurrent trials. Your response is 3, or you might have 1 3, and the response still has to be 1, even though the number you're seeing on the screen is 3. So that's counterintuitive and concurrent, because you have these a conflict between the number you're seeing on the screen and the number you actually have to press in the response. And in terms of no-go, we also had a different task, which is more response inhibition task with 2 different levels. So this is a no-go task where they are infrequent trials where you have to not respond. And so the dominant response is to actually respond to the stimulus. And we had 2 levels, a simple one and a complex one. The complex one needed 1 level to remember what happened in the trial before, so there was some work memory load. So in terms of the results, what we found was that controlling for performance on control trials, better semantic inhibition, so in terms of the reaction time measure in the strip task, predicted higher counterintuitive reasoning accuracy across science and maths, and explaining around 5% of the variance, unique variance, and better response inhibition on the complex task that had some work memory component, was associated with longer counterintuitive reasoning reaction time, explaining around 1% of the variance. So this would suggest that adolescents were better in inhibitory control, were more accurate on the counterintuitive reasoning tasks, but also responded more slowly. And again, the amount of variance explained was not very big, but there was some association. Sorry for a squeaky chair. Okay, so just to summarize that bit, the research, some of our research and others suggest that the individual differences in cognitive control associated with academic achievement, and that reasoning about counterintuitive concepts may rely particularly on inhibitory control, but overall the behavioral associations are quite small. So next we were interested in studying going a little bit deeper and seeing whether we might be finding association in terms of the neural correlates of counterintuitive reasoning and inhibitory control. So this is just as a placeholder. This is an image of a scanner, an MRI scanner, so magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and that's the method that we use to look at the neural correlates of the task. So we were not the first people to do this. There was quite a lot of research done, in particular by a team in Canada, looking at these counterintuitive reasoning tasks. And they studied adults initially, and then adolescents. And there was also a team by Stevie and Babai who also interested in this topic. And so first the question is, what did they find? What did this prior research find in terms of neural correlates of counterintuitive reasoning? So some studies use only a single math concept, others a single physics concept, and a couple use more varied range of concepts, but usually they tend to be kind of quite specific. And you can see, so this is showing slices of the brain, and each dot represents the peak of activation observed in a particular comparison. And so at the top is comparing incongruent to congruent trials, so basically counterintuitive trials versus more intuitive trials. And you can see there is not that much consistency in terms of where the location of activations. There's some region quite in the ventral lateral prefrontal cortex, in the anterior insula, other part of the prefrontal cortex, and also more superior part of the frontal cortex, as well as some more parietal regions. These researchers were also interested in running other type of comparisons, seeing whether experts in a particular domain might show different activation to novices. And the idea here is that experts on a particular domain have assimilated maybe better assimilated what the correct answer is on these counterintuitive concepts, and maybe better able through practice, because of their training, to give the correct answer and to inhibit the intuitive answer. And so they were comparing in these tasks counterintuitive to counterintuitive and intuitive trials, and where they would see greater activations in expert versus novices. And there's a little bit more consistency in terms of the results here, where there's more activation in more ventral, lateral frontal cortex activation regions, and also a little bit more on the medial wall in one study. The key here is that in the same way that intuitive trials, congruent trials tend to be easier than counterintuitive trials, here in these contrasts, the novices tended to have less good accuracy than the experts. So they didn't tend to kind of perform the task as well as the expert. So that was kind of the evidence, and on the basis of these results, a lot of the researchers in these papers were arguing that the activations were reflecting in the recruitment of inhibitory control during counterintuitive reasoning. But although that was kind of what they were predicting, it's quite hard to do this type of inference from the data, because as you can see, it's not very consistent in where the activations were observed. And the extent to which that we know where, which brain regions are specifically involved in inhibitory control, there's still a lot of debate about that. So what we were interested in doing is having the same participants carrying out counterintuitive reasoning tasks, but also inhibitory control tasks that we could use at what's called localizers. So we can localize where in the brain there seem to be neural correlates of inhibitory control, and then seeing whether it's the same brain regions as we might be finding in counterintuitive reasoning tasks. So this is what we did with Annie in an adolescent sample, again, so following on the behavioral study. And so they did pretty much the same task as I showed before, slightly adapted to be in a scanner. And they were in doing both science and maths. And we didn't find differences between science and maths. There's some behavioral differences. So they found the participants were a bit more accurate and on their science task. But in terms of brain activity, there were no differences. And this is the brain activity comparing counterintuitive trials to the control trials. And so you can see the activation in the parietal cortex bilaterally, in the superior frontal cortex here, as well as more prefrontal lateral prefrontal cortex region on both sides laterally. And this is extracting the activation and showing that for control trials and counterintuitive trials. And you can see that actually for most of these regions, there was already activation during control trials, but they showed greater activations for counterintuitive than for control trials, except for one region, the right Brodmann area 40, so the right parietal cortex, where the activation seemed to be a bit more specific for the counterintuitive trial. And on the right, you've got activation for the two inhibitory control tasks. So this is the complex go-no-go versus go blocks. We didn't actually find any difference of activation for the simple go-no-go blocks compared to go. And at the bottom is the numerical strips, comparing mixed blocks where you have incongruent and congruent trials to blocks where you only have congruent trials. And so what we were interested in saying, okay, if these are the neural correlates of inhibitory control, do we see actually overlap and similarities with the activations we're finding in the counterintuitive and reasoning contrast? This is what we're finding. So it's these same contrasts, but sort of shown differently through slices in the brain. So going, this is the front of the brain, the back of the brain, and with slices going from the bottom up. In blue, you've got the inhibitory control, go-no-go task, and in red, the science and math, counterintuitive control, and in pink is regions of overlap. And so you can see that there are some regions of overlap in the superior frontal cortex, well, dorsolateral maybe, and superior frontal cortex, and also in the parietal cortex. But there are also a lot of regions where there's specificity. So, for example, these more ventral or kind of ventral lateral cortex regions seem to be more specific for the counterintuitive reasoning tasks and don't show up in the complex go-no-go tasks. Reversely, there's a lot more activation in the complex go-no-go task in the sort of superior frontal cortex and part of the medial frontal cortex and parietal cortex overall. And for the stroke task, the pattern is actually very similar, where we have regions actually showing overlap in both, well, all three tasks, so counterintuitive and both inhibitory control tasks, superior frontal cortex and the parietal cortex. So we are finding regions of univariate overlap. So that means the same voxel, the same brain regions seem to be showing increased activation for counterintuitive reasoning and increased activations for inhibitory control. The problem is that, and that was the reviewers argued, that it's not sufficient to show that the same regions are activated, show greater activation, or the same voxels show greater activation in an fMRI study, because a single voxel can include tens of thousands of neurons. So in fact, it could be different neurons that are activated, that are recruited for these tasks, even though they're in the same brain region. So to study this, we use multivariate analysis. And this is kind of quite complex type of, oops, sorry, I forgot, going back one step. I'll come back to that. I'll come back to multivariate analysis. I forgot to say that we also looked at the comparison of correct versus incorrect trials, which is maybe a bit more specific. The idea being on correct trials, these are trials where participants successfully inhibited their intuitive response and give the correct response instead. And you can see that only they are in green, and there's only a few clusters that were showing this difference between correct and incorrect trials. And they were showing overlap with the two inhibitory control tasks again. Okay, so as I said, the problem is that we're not sure that the same neural the same neurons might be activated in these different tasks. And so the multivariate analysis, I'm not going to go into the details. We can, if you want to ask about it, we can ask during the questions. But the basic of it is that we're looking at lots of different data points, voxels, and trying to see whether across these voxels there are similarities across tasks. So maybe you have, let's imagine you have 100 voxels, and some of them show greater activation in particular individual participants for one task, and trying to see whether it's actually the same voxel specifically that also show greater activation in another task. And you run these as correlation between loads of different audio participants, and then you're trying to say, okay, is there kind of similarity of distribution of activation across my voxels, across my participants between the two tasks? And so the prediction would be that if it's the same neurons that are activated in both tasks, then when you look at a voxel, you would see similar patterns of activation over a range of voxels between participants and between tasks. Anyway, always quite complicated to explain this, and I should have maybe put more figures to try and help. But basically, so trying to see whether we have a sort of positive correlation between science and maths. And what we're finding is that although we have good evidence of overlap in the univariate analysis, the multivariate analysis shows good similarities between the two inhibitory control tasks. We show these kind of big bars here across our different brain regions, but not so much between science and math and the inhibitory control tasks. So for example, here there's only the right Brodmann AR40 for the strip task, and it's a trend for the go-no-go task that shows significant similarity between the science math counterintuitive reasoning and inhibitory control. And so this is for the main contrast. And then if we look at counterintuitive correct versus incorrect, the multivariate analysis are a little bit stronger. And so there's a little bit more evidence that they are similarity of kind of neural system, neural regions activated between the science and math reasoning and the inhibitory control tasks for the specific correct versus incorrect comparison. But they are not in the prefrontal cortex, they're only in parietal regions. And so not the type of regions that previous research had suggested were specifically involved in inhibitory control and that kind of showing up in counterintuitive reasoning tasks studies. Okay, so this was the research in adolescents, and now Lucy is going to speak about work she's been doing with younger children.
Coming out of the corner of the room. Hiya. So yeah, as Iroise said, I'm going to talk about my first year PhD project, which builds on this work, but looking at a sample of children as opposed to adolescents or adults in previous work. And this is interesting because, as Iroise mentioned, the behavioural studies have suggested that there are positive correlations between inhibitory control performance and counterintuitive reasoning, and also this idea that with executive functions, so that's working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive shifting, it may be that it's more unitary at younger age groups, and it sort of dissociates as through development. So this is why we're quite interested in looking at whether there are behavioural and neural associations between inhibitory control and science and maths counterintuitive reasoning in primary school children. And we were also quite interested to look at whether these associations differ between 7 to 8-year-olds and 9 to 10-year-olds. So these age groups were chosen based on the previous literature and also for practical reasons. I don't know if I've ever tried to put a 5-year-old in an MRI scanner and ask them to stay completely still for 50 minutes, but yeah, it's quite a challenge. So in our study, we had 56 children originally from 13 primary schools as part of the unlocked data set, which Iroise will talk about a little bit later. We had 2 outliers due to quite poor performance. So in our behavioural analysis, we had 54 children. And in our neuroimaging analysis, we had 38. And again, this was due to 1 missing data, so children not being able to complete the full scan for various reasons, and also head motion, trying to keep them still in the scanner. So in the scanner, we asked them to complete a maths and science counterintuitive reasoning task And you can see some of the examples of these trials on the right here. So you might want to have a go yourself. You can have this true or false. So are these fractions ordered from smallest to largest, true or false? And you might be, at first you might think, oh, well, 8's bigger than 2, right? The denominator is bigger, so, oh, wait. And then you have to realize it's a fraction, and actually an 8 is in fact smaller than a half. So there's just a couple of examples there. We also asked them to complete 2 inhibitory control tasks, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And we also asked them to complete an additional maths and science counterintuitive reasoning task outside the scanner, so in their school, as well as another inhibitory control task. This is a modified go, no-go task, a whack-a-mole task. If you see a mole, you respond. If you see an aubergine, you don't respond. And a variety of working memory and IQ tasks. So these are the inhibitory control tasks that we asked students to complete children to complete in the scanner. And as Iroise mentioned earlier, there's a debate about whether inhibitory control is a unitary construct, so it's all just inhibitory control and that's that, or whether it's a bit more nuanced than that if you've got different subcomponents of inhibitory control. And the literature suggests that there is a sort of divide between something called interference control, so your ability to inhibit semantic knowledge, memories, and response inhibition, which is your ability to inhibit a motor response. So in order to measure these, we have an animal size Stroop task where you're asked to press on the larger side of the animal in real life. So for the first one, we've got a large elephant and a small mouse. Elephants are in fact bigger than mice, so we click on the elephant, that's great. But for the incongruent trials, you can see you've got a very big ladybird and a very small cow. You may be tempted to click on the ladybird if you've got a lot of congruent trials and then suddenly an incongruent trial. But we actually want to click on the right side and click on the cow, as it were. And then we have a response inhibition task, which is a modified Pokemon go, no-go task. So go for green and blue and withhold your response for the orange Pokemon. So with regards to the results, we'll start with behavioural results. We observed a positive correlation between the animal Stroop incongruent trial reaction time when we covaried for the congruent reaction time and the maths counterintuitive reasoning accuracy. So this is sort of what we'd expect. We only saw this in year 5 students, which we think might be due to the noisier data in the year 3 group. And I forgot to mention year 5 is age 9 to 10 and UK school system, and year 3 is 7 to 8. So yes, we observed this in year 5 children, but not year 3. And we also observed this in the maths counterintuitive reading accuracy scores, but not the science. And again, we think that might be due to a slightly more challenging series of science trials, but we're sort of looking into that at the moment. And then we wanted to look at the neurocorrelates in a similar fashion to the previous study. We want to look at the neurocorrelates of maths and science counterintuitive reasoning and our inhibitory control tasks. So first look at maths and science counterintuitive reasoning. You can see that the maths activation is here in red and the science is in blue, and then purple is the overlap. So you can see they're quite similar regions, although there are a few areas, particularly with math near the top of the brain that's got a bit more activation. But there's also, it's not just that there are differences in the level of activation. So although they're the same regions, you can see that maths has greater activation than science in these parietal and frontal regions, whereas for science there appears to be more activation or high level of activation in the occipital and temporal regions, which is quite interesting. And then we wanted to add in our inhibitory control activation and look at the overlap with counterintuitive reasoning and inhibitory control. Much like Iroise's adolescent study, we didn't see any differences in activation between the go trials, so the blue and green Pokemon, versus the no-go trials, which is the orange Pokemon. We didn't see any difference in activation between those two, suggesting that maybe our task was perhaps too easy, or it isn't isolating that inhibitory control as we would expect. Therefore, the Pokemon go, no-go data was not used in further analysis. So we're just focusing on the animal Stroop inhibitory control here in green. So yeah, we've got a variety of large, broad, parietal, frontoparietal regions and occipital regions as well. And you can see that the sort of nice brown color sort of shows the overlap across all those 3 tasks. And then this is a very similar image, but just shown slightly differently. And we can see here that there's overlap between the maths and science counterintuitive reasoning tasks and the animal street task in regions such as the occipital lobes and parietal regions. But interestingly, the right inferior frontal gyrus and the left middle frontal gyrus as well, which is promising because those regions have been associated with the neural correlates of inhibitory control in other studies. So that's great. And also a couple of subcortical regions such as the right thalamus and right hippocampus. And so much like Iroise's study, we wanted to use a multivariate similarity to sort of pinpoint with a slight more accuracy the regions that are showing overlap and activation. So we use these regions here as regions of interest, and then we looked at the voxel-voxel correlations. You can see on the left we've got the correlations between the science task and the street task, and on the right the maths and the street, and all the cortical regions were significant. So we've got, again, left middle frontal gyrus, left precentral, right inferior frontal gyrus, right supplementary motor area, and the occipital and parietal regions. Yeah, and then something I'm looking into this week, as it were, I'm also looking at how the activation, so the performance in the street task correlates with the neural activation in the maths counterintuitive reasoning task, and we found a positive correlation between activation in the maths counterintuitive reasoning and the animal street incongruent reaction time performance in the right inferior frontal gyrus, which is again very interesting. This has been argued that this is the seat of inhibitory control by Aaron et al. So to summarize this last bit with the adolescent and the childhood studies, so previous studies have shown activation in quite inconsistent prefrontal cortex regions. So that's why we wanted to include an inhibitory control localizer in these studies. Partial overlap between neural correlates of inhibitory control and science and maths counterintuitive reasoning has been observed in childhood and adolescence and adulthood here. And then the multivariate analysis suggests neural overlap in the parietal cortex only in adolescence, which may suggest perhaps more involvement of working memory or perhaps visual spatial attention, whereas in children, this is much broader regions of overlap have been observed. However, it must be noted that there's slight differences in the methodology between these 2 studies in adolescents and children. For example, Iroise showed us that in the adolescent study we had matched controls and matched non-counterintuitive controls that were very similar to the counterintuitive trials, but obviously we're not counterintuitive. But due to the complexity of the design for which this data was collected, and Iroise will talk about more about the other use of this data in a second, but because of the complexity, we used an interactive baseline for this study as opposed to a match control, and that might be one of the reasons why we're seeing slightly broader areas of overlap in the childhood study. So I think I'm going to finish there and pass back to you.
Great, thanks. So I realized I was maybe optimistic about how much we could cover in 45 minutes. So I kind of quite more quickly talk about the unlock results, the stop and think intervention evaluation, but that's okay because I think there should be there might be a recording of it somewhere. Or so we have this association between inhibitory control, well, cognitive control in general, and academic performance. And so there's a big question about whether you can train cognitive control and then improve academic achievement. So can you do it? Can you train it? And I'll go through it quite quickly, but it's been tried quite a lot with working memory. And the idea is that if you just keep practicing a working memory task through potentially on video game type little tasks, then you might train your networks that support working memory, and then gradually that will transfer and then lead to improvement in arithmetic, reading, attention, and other things. So this is based on repeated computerized practice, and the evidence is that the executive functions do improve, that you see improvement in working memory, for example, on similar tasks, similar working memory tasks. but you don't, there's very limited evidence of transfer to other domains. So you can improve work memory, but you don't seem to be improving maths, which was very disappointing for a lot of researchers on this domain. So here we're looking at inhibitory control, talking about potential interactions, implications for science, maths, or even socially in terms of turn taking, whether you can wait for it to be your turn to speak or to do a task. And so, and instead of doing a repeated sort of computerized practice of the same trial again and again, here we're trying to see whether we could encourage children at a more strategy level. And here trying to encourage them to stop and think about the response. But instead of doing it within a very kind of domain general inhibitory control task, for example, one of those truth or go-no-go tasks that we talked about and then we've used in our studies, the aim, the attempt was to try to embed the training within what we were trying to improve, which is science and maths counterintuitive reasoning. So this is kind of more based on strategy. There's still some repeated practice, but it's done in a very specific context. And so the hope here is that the transfer won't have to be as far because you're already within a science and math context. And so how can we try to get children to engage more in this kind of slower, more logical reasoning and inhibit the intuitive thinking? Well, some of the research, early research on this was done by Olivier Houdet, who has a lab in Paris. And they were using a logical rule, and I don't have time to go to all the details, but it's a kind of a logic game, and where the response is counterintuitive. So the intuitive answer that people give is incorrect. And so they did a kind of one-go 20-minute training with participants, and they told them in this problem, the source of the error lies in a habit we all have on concentrating on cards of the letter or number mentioned in the rule and not paying attention to the other cards. And then they told them, they kind of went through practice, and they told them that the goal is to not fall into the trap of the two cards, A and 3 mentioned in the rule, to consider all the cards. And you have to make sure you eliminate the wrong ones, the ones that make you fall into the trap. So the idea here is that they made the fact that the response was counterintuitive, that the intuition was incorrect, that there was sort of a trap here, very salient and apparent to participants. And that seems to have been intrinsic to making participants progress on this task, or to kind of respond correctly. And so these warning elements are necessary. Just explaining the logic of the task is not enough. So as if in a classroom, the teacher is saying, oh, watch out, saying it's the Earth that's rotating around itself. It's not the sun that's going around the Earth. Just saying that possibly is not enough. You have to say, oh, it looks like the sun is going, but actually this is a sort of trap. That's not the reality, and you have to make this apparent. And so when they did this, and they scanned participants before and after, they found that after the training, when people gave the more logical, correct response, there was more engagement of more prefrontal cortex regions compared to earlier, where they were potentially relying more on perception. Another way we can potentially improve things, this is work done initially by Adele Diamond, and I can you can easily find the video. I don't want to have time to play it again, but this is based on the day-night tasks where children are, it's basically an inhibitory control task appropriate for very young children. Children are shown a card, and when they see the moon, they have to say day, and when they see the sun, they have to say night. So they have to say the reverse of the normal association. And what Adele Diamond showed was that if you're asking children to do the task, but before they answer, the experimenter sings a little song, so imposing a delay on the response, then the children do respond much better. So the accuracy is much higher when you impose a delay in a response. So as if you're giving time for the correct response to sort of beat and compete the intuitive incorrect response. So the intervention, the stop and think intervention with design, was based on these two components. And this is a very large collaborative project that was funded by the Wellcome Trust and Educational Neuroscience Foundation. and with colleagues at UCL and UCL Birkbeck, and also collaboration with learners. So what we did was developed and tested this intervention program, which was trying to make children aware of the existence of counterintuitive concepts and to try to train them to use their inhibitory control skills to successfully solve counterintuitive problems. And they did the training in class as a whole class with the training program going on the screen on the whiteboard. They were doing it their teachers, and they were doing 3 times a week at the start of a math or science lesson, so replacing math or science time, so it's not additional math or science time. And there were 12 minutes per session, which covered 1 science counterintuitive concept and 1 math counterintuitive concept. And like in our tasks that we did in the scanner, the content was adapted to each year group. And it was presented as a sort of game where you had different players, and you would see a particular question. So for example, here is what number is shown by the blocks, and you have Andy, who is kind of taking you through the game, and you have a delay that is imposed after the question where you see the different players thinking about it, and that's encourage you and enforcing a delay where everyone has to think about it. And then you might kind of give your answer. And if your answer is incorrect, you might have another trial. If you're still incorrect, you might see what the other players are thinking. And one of them might be thinking the correct concept and and another one the intuitive incorrect concept. And then you can have another go. And if you still get it wrong, then you get told the correct correct reasoning, and then you can have the answer. But it's basically trying to kind of get through. The aim was not to teach children about this concept, but it's trying to get them to stop and think about it repeatedly and kind of a particular concept. And after this particular session, they had this first trial. They went through a series of 5, 6 more trials on the same concept, where every time again they had to stop and think before responding. So this was done after a pilot study that was quite promising in 84 schools with more than 5,000 children. We had an active control condition based on social emotional learning program on half of the control classes. It was independently evaluated. The pre-training measure was the foundation stage profile score, and the post-training assessment was on standardized tests of math and science. And so what was the results? Across the years, we found the independent evaluators found a statistically significant 2 months improvement in science and non-significant 1 month improvement in maths. And so here I've got the raw scores for maths, year 3, year 5, science, year 3, year 5, for the stop and think. So this is after the training for the stop and think group versus the control group. So if you can see, first thing that the effect, overall is not very large, but this is a 10-week intervention. And on the right is just the effect size itself. So basically looking at the difference between these two controlling for the foundation score. And you can see that this is a combined effect for science, combined effect for maths. So maths is the one that's kind of just not significant. And for both year group, the effect was driven by year 5. So it was bigger for year 5 children than year 3 children. We tried to get some feedback from teachers, and they appreciated that the training was quite quick and mostly kind of able to deliver as intended. They didn't endorse the rollout of the current program because there was kind of some software difficulty and some of the contents that was maybe not accurate enough or not the right difficulty level. And so they kind of still need some more work on this, which we have done since. But some of the feedback said things like stop and think, help pupils to further develop social skills, such as listening and considering other people's point of view, which is very interesting in terms of potential broader impact. Again, like they said, they took this to other lesson. And the game show and contestants and animation did encourage people to reason more, which enhanced their learning. And they also said things that suggested that the teacher may have benefited as well from the program, helping them to kind of think of misconceptions that the children might have in the class. and have insights about how children's activity might change if you give them time. We also did some secondary analysis based on free school meal status as a proxy for socioeconomic status. The sample size is much smaller for these analyses. There was maybe some tentative evidence that for maths in particular, children on free school meals showed a greater benefit in year 3. So it might be more suited for some children, maybe with lower starting skills. And we also found that the effects remain significant if you compared specifically to the C+, the kind of socio-emotional condition training. I think we're running out of time, so I kind of won't go through this in detail, but we've tried to follow up in terms of what could be the mechanism of impact. And we're not finding too much in terms of behaviorally on a kind of much smaller sample of participants. We found improvement in counterintuitive reasoning in the younger children, but not the older children, and the older children was the one who were benefited from the program overall, so that's kind of a bit counterintuitive. And we also didn't find any improvement in other measures of executive functions, and that individual differences in executive function at the starting point did not predict improvement in training effects. We have been working with Andrea Gauthier on refining the intervention in terms of how to encourage children to stop and think more. And Denis is now leading or kind of advising on a new rollout of the randomized control trial of this modified intervention. So just to summarize, the training strategy within a particular domain might be more beneficial than repeated practice of executive functions. So the stop and think did have a positive impact. However, you need really large samples to find effects, and that means it's quite difficult to study mechanisms of these studies because we always have much smaller samples when we have a lot of measures, and also the mechanism might be different at different ages. And you do need a broad interdisciplinary team to do this kind of project. And so as I said, we're refining this intervention, and there's more testing happening. So to conclude, overall, there's some behavioral evidence of the involvement of inhibitory control in science and maths, counterintuitive reasoning. The neural evidence remains weak. So I've shown initially this review of other studies, the consistency, there's not much consistency in the location of activation. In our adolescent sample, we found there was univariate overlap, but not much multivariate overlap. In the younger children, however, there's possibly more association if this I guess, general prefrontal cortex functioning is a bit more unitary, involved in a bit everything. Maybe that's why we're finding more in younger children. And some of the findings we're observing might relate to other aspects of cognitive control, such as working memory. And also, more specifically, it's quite difficult in this field to distinguish between trials that are correct, because the intuitive answer has been inhibited, and trials that are correct because the participant doesn't seem to really have this misconception. And the kind of reversely, also between trials that are incorrect because the intuitive answer has not been inhibited, or trials that are incorrect because the participants didn't learn this or didn't remember this. I couldn't kind of retrieve the correct concept. So thank you for your attention. We have time for questions now, and you can see more about the Stop and Think project on the Unlock website, and more publication on our lab.
Thank you both. You covered a lot of really interesting findings there. You've got a couple of questions in the chat already, if you'd like me to read them out. So the first question, I've been reading about dyscalculia, which seems to stem from the parietal lobe, at least in part. Considering a dyscalculics challenge with subvertising and comparisons, I'm curious about the overlap here. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it's true. That's a good question. We didn't really discuss that much in the paper, but it's true that the parietal cortex has been implicated in dyscalculia and the order, like magnitude comparisons, whether in space or with numbers, but also time and other things. So when I tried to figure out exactly which brain region that was where we were finding the overlap, it didn't seem to match exactly the intraparietal sulcus region that has been involved in dyscalculia. I was hopeful it might, but it didn't. It seemed to be related to the extent that we can do these kind of reverse inference analysis, and I was using the Neuroscience website. that related maybe more to attention, mental rotation, and working memory, possibly. So it's still kind of, I think what would need more is potentially do the same type of study, but with a working memory task, or maybe a magnitude comparison task, to have kind of other localizer to kind of have a better understanding of which brain regions really we're looking at.
Brilliant. Someone else wanted to clarify whether the exercises were conducted in a lab setting.
Yeah, so for Annie's first study, the behavioral study, there was done at school, but in a quiet environment, sort of one-on-one on a computer, rather than a pen and paper tasks. And then for the scanning studies, they were done in the lab, in the scanner. And for the unlock study, the science and math assessment that was done at the end was done in class, as a whole class, as a sort of standardized test.
Great, thank you. And I had a question for you as well. I was wondering why you thought you saw the differences in activation for the maths and science tasks, and whether you thought that was to do with the difficulty of them, because I think Lucy said something about the science one potentially being easier.
Yeah.
Or more difficult. I might have got that the wrong way around.
Yeah. So yeah, we think that so we tried to match the trials to each age group. Obviously it's quite challenging to know whether these students are finding it difficult because they're struggling to inhibit the counterintuitive problem, or they've got it wrong because they learned it 6 months ago, or maybe some students learned it last week. That's something that's very difficult to control for with these studies. I think the differences in math and science is also down to the way they're presented. So the maths ones would be more sort of visual spatial in terms of, you're trying to maybe look at 3D shapes, whereas the science ones may require a bit more reading and interpretation of what those concepts are, and sort of less reliance on the images, which I think is why, if I got it the right way around off the top of my head, it's more occipital for the math, I think it was.
I'll try and put it back up.
Yeah,
I think it's tricky. So for all of the tasks, we did try to have a picture and text, but as Lucy said, each trial might vary a little bit to the extent to which the picture was necessary. Sometimes it was just a sort of to give a bit of context, whether you actually needed to look at the picture to do the task was kind of to have the example of stimuli. And I'm just wondering whether. So, for example, the science one, a dolphin is a fish. You don't really need to see a picture of a dolphin to give the answer. Well, for the math one, it's actually you need to look at the numbers. But the electrical circuit, you do need to look at it. So I don't know whether there might have been some variability between this. So if anything, in science, they actually maybe looked at the screen a bit more than they did for the maths. But that could be a factor.
Thank you, that makes sense. I think we'll do one more question. There's one from Michael in the chat. Michael, do you want to read it, or shall I read it out?
Oh, I can read it. Fantastic talk. Thanks very much. Lots of stuff there. So I'm just wondering, when you have the juxtaposition between looking at regions of overlap in your brain activations from your fMRI, and then you're moving to training on tasks to improve performance, is the underlying logic that you're going to generate an expectation that if two tasks generate overlapping regions of activation, that training on one task is going to improve performance on the other?
Well, it feels like that's a sort of necessary, but not what's the other word? But not
sufficient.
Sufficient. Trying to find, necessary but not sufficient. So I think that's the step where we're trying to look. If there is no overlap, suggesting it's not the same brain regions involved, then you wouldn't expect that training one would have any impact on the other. So I think that this is sort of trying to see, is there any overlap? And what we're finding is that it's actually not that obvious. So we're finding if some univariate overlaps or some overall voxels activated, but as I said, within those voxels, there are very different, potentially different populations of neurons. And so in the adolescent study, we find quite limited evidence of neural overlap. in the children one, we find a bigger overlap, but because we don't have the control trials, we're finding it a little bit difficult at this point to know whether it's really reflecting something specific to the counterintuitive reasoning, or whether it's actually reflecting kind of more general science and math reasoning and sort of demands. So yeah, so the answer would be that if we had stronger multivariate pattern like results, then I think we would say the evidence is quite strong that, well, that from that basis you probably would you would predict benefits, but we're not actually finding that very strongly. So why are we not finding it? Maybe things that we've been discussing before, that these neural systems are dependent on the type of domain. So you might have brain networks where you're trying to inhibit science and math things, and you have associations and networks and kind of connections that are relevant to that. And you might have other networks, but going through the same brain regions, but not through the same neurons, that might be involved in inhibiting, the size of the animals or your response, your dominant response in the Pokemon task.
Sounds good. I'd be interested to know whether anyone has actually tested the inference by taking two tasks where they know there's transfer and then seeing whether you see regions of overlap.
The thing is that there's not that much transfer. You mean on two different work memory tasks, for example?
Yeah, so presumably it'd be cases of near transfer, which are generally endorsed, even if far transfer is not.
Yeah, I don't think that's been done. So I mean, we were quite hopeful when we did the paper. Initially, we thought we were just showing univariate overlap would be really good and a step forward. And the reviewers were like, that's not sufficient. You need to show, sort of multivariate analysis. And so I don't think it's been done much at all, this type of analysis where you have different tasks and you're trying to see whether there's similarities in activation.
Super, thanks very much.
Okay, since we've already run over, I think I'll close the meeting now. Thank you both so much again, and thanks everyone for attending. I hope you'll join us next week at the same time, where we'll hear from Tamara de Kaidek from Brunel University, and she'll be talking about her lab's research into aerobic exercise and its effects on working memory. Thank you very much.
Thanks, bye.